I want to give a bit of a response on Steve Jobs' thoughts on Flash. First off, I find it very interesting that Jobs felt compelled enough to give his thoughts, his opinions, and it make front page on Apple.com. Whatever the reasons may be, it's within Apple's right to ban Flash from their mobile devices. I support Jobs in him saying, hey, I don't want Flash on my mobile devices. But what I am responding to is Jobs makes a statement in saying that Apple is being accused of making this move of banning Flash as being primarily driven by a business decision. And he states no, and goes on to state that it has to do with technical issues, and then itemizes them within the letter. Jobs goes on to state that Adobe makes accusations that Apple is a closed system, and then goes on to state that quite the opposite is true, even though they sell a tremendous amount of proprietary products. I'm going to agree with Jobs on that statement, but I think Jobs misses the point that Adobe was making, in that Apple's products definitely use open standards, but it's the ecosystem that is closed. Everything that enters within the Apple's bubble, in essence, the bubble being that which is closed. I applaud Jobs on boosting many open standards, from using OpenGL, OpenAL, OpenCL, LLVM, and so on. Fantastic work. But what Adobe was after was the ecosystem. In that, Apple does like to control the user experience, and therefore makes business decisions in trying to ensure that result. But then again, Apple is not alone in that regard. Microsoft does a heavy amount of the same bubble work, as I've cited in other videos. Take, for example, J++, their own version of C#, so on and so forth. Now, of course, the equivalent to that on the Mac side would be Objective-C to the C# equivalent. So everybody's really having their own protective bubble. But in many cases, Apple's ecosystem, to ensure, or their ideology, let's just put it that way, Apple perceives that a better user experience is achieved by having better control over its entire ecosystem, everything going in and out, whether it is third party or native to Apple. So, from Adobe's point of view, being a third party to development for the Apple platform is now having a door slammed in its face into the bubble of the Apple ecosystem. So from their point of view, it certainly is closed. Jobs then goes on to saying, well, we've adopted HTML5, CSS, and JavaScript. And that's great. But quite frankly, being open doesn't always guarantee a great user experience, nor does being proprietary. But the assumption is, it is implied in the letter that using open standards provides a better result. And that is not necessarily the case at all. Having a proprietary model, essentially, which is closed, and being Flash being that ubiquitous, has many benefits for developers. It provides a consistency. Whereas open standards, even within Safari itself, using HTML5, has very varied performance, whether it's on a Mac system or a Windows system. And I can tell you, I applaud Apple's efforts to try to push standards. But in the 14 years that I've been developing, the web has yet to get anywhere remotely close to all working together for one common goal. Whether it's Apple deciding to go one direction, whether it's the use of Java, whether it's the use of ActiveX, whether it's Microsoft's browser, whether it's Firefox browser. Everybody uses these benchmarking tests, whether it's like acid, something or other, and then that has its own little private world thinking that these tests saying, well, the browser should do this, and it's completely arbitrary. A company can see fit to do whatever they really wish to in the browser that they have for the experience. And I can tell you, it's still a nightmare to code and try to get a consistent result across the board. So I continue to apply Apple in that, but I think that's more wishful thinking. Then Jobs goes into saying, well, we have a development kit. I applaud Apple for doing that. And I do think that Adobe could jump on that bandwagon. I don't see any excuse for Adobe in saying, let's use the Flash toolkits and the programming toolkits to produce HTML5 out, or a mixture thereof of CSS and JavaScript that could run. It essentially is the same programming environment as what they would have to cross-compile to any other iPhone native app as they have done within their toolkit, so they could certainly arrive at doing and utilizing and preserving a Flash developer base using Flash tools to output HTML5. Because my guess is, even though I'm not a Flash developer, you could probably produce a result faster, and the devs that are also used to the Flash, because it's so visual, than writing tons and lines of codes and things like that, especially in JavaScript, whether you're using Ajax or any type of connectivity going back and forth, asynchronous, synchronous, what have you. And that if a visual programming development environment speeds up that and can attract more developers using Adobe's toolkit to output that, I think that would be in the interest for Adobe to look at. However, thus far, these 2 points are still business decisions. They are not technical issues. Being proprietary is not a technical issue. A company can choose to use proprietary, or a company can choose to use an open standard. There is no provable benefit in saying one is superior to the other than if you were to debate open source and that. But an open standard does not equal open source, i.e. OpenGL. It's an open standard, but it's not open source. Then Jobs goes on to explain the full web, and that really the users aren't missing a whole lot by the exclusion of Flash. I'm going to remain neutral, but by my own observations, I know too many that do complain that they wish Flash would run. However, I do counter and say that Flash is indeed not ready to go mobile. It is very much still a desktop type medium. But Adobe is releasing a mobile version, and we shall see how it does perform. Then Jobs goes on to say that Flash claims a huge amount of games on the web. I would say they do have a tremendous amount of games in the full web experience. In the mobile environment, no. They've delayed their product in going mobile. But in the full web, they certainly do have a tremendous amount of games. However, there's a contradiction in that many of the games on the iPhone and iPad platform are from third-party development layers where cross-compiling does occur. So long as those mediums exist, Jobs is absolutely right. But it is hard to avoid double standards in policy in saying, hey, origin source must be X, Y, and Z, when clearly there are many providers that the origin source code is not compliant. But I say, hey, it's okay to tell Adobe, hey, we're not yet ready for you. Now comes really the one and only technical issue, which is security. But even OS X itself has proof of concept exploits. There are proof of concept exploits in Flash, proof of concept exploits within Microsoft, within many products. There were proof of concept exploits within QuickTime. Thus, exploits are ubiquitous in themselves. It's a lot like the pot calling the kettle black. Now, of course, people can argue, well, there's the frequency and margin of how many exploits. Certainly. It's one of the points I debated within market share and viruses within Windows. However, proof of concepts are a very different thing In essence, they have to be exploited. And within the run that Flash has been on the desktop platform of OS X, many Apple advocates and supporters are still debating the lack of viruses and the lack of exploits. So this has to be taken into consideration as well. Second, reliability. A lot of that has to do with the partnerships between OS X and Flash. One being hardware acceleration, how it is encoded and decoded within specifically video. If you're outside of video, the performance is completely moot at that point. But within video, which is really the whole crux of a lot of this, hardware acceleration is now coming to Mac OS X in new forms of encode and decode. Will it work well on OS X? Remains to be seen. It is still in beta as when I last checked. I'm not a big Flash user other than on YouTube. I've never really supported Flash myself. I've also gone the route back in the day when it was still under Macromedia saying, hey, I can do a lot of the same visual things within code available to me. Of course, it became more and more difficult as Flash really expanded beyond just simple presentations, actually having back-end servers and streaming. There's a tremendous amount of benefits that Flash eventually incorporated that are very powerful even today. Then Jobs goes on to saying, well, yeah, Adobe did promise their mobile version, and it's been delayed and delayed. Yep, delays do happen. And again, good business decision. You shouldn't have held your breath. But I have a point to that later on in the video. Then Jobs goes on to battery life. Really, in the end, the more we push devices, the more the battery's going to be drained. I have a video coming up on features that were added to OS 4 that will get into battery life and how those were business decisions. And saying, well, we're going to take away this feature, but yet add this feature, even though that still drains the battery. We've come a long way in battery technology, but even within task switching and running concurrency, you're still not going to get the battery life that you would like to have. Sure, there's a margin that you try to achieve, but most of the time, battery life, very difficult thing, because it's really dependent on the user. If I myself am a user that uses a very intensive application, I'm going to get way less to battery life than maybe a user who just simply does easy browsing. So it's all over the place, and I don't think battery life should be used as a specification for performance. If you want to use an easy average of saying these claims that we have for how many hours used is based upon very light browsing, light applications, so on and so forth, is that really going to be the thing that you want to base a whole lot on? Moreover, there's nothing saying that HTML5 is not going to drain the browser. As soon as you use the Canvas API and running videos, you're still going to be draining the battery faster than, say, a lighter use of the application. But Jobs is right. There is no mobile version of Flash yet that can address those issues. But it is coming, so we shall see on that. But getting back to the battery, claims about battery life and such are all business decisions on what is let in and what is taken out of a system. Specifically, which I will get into my next video, which is on iAds. And background services that are new and going to be used within the system that will drain the battery and other things taken out. All of those things are still business decisions. Because if we were truly making it a technical issue to extend battery life, our mobile experiences would be drastically different than they are now. Then Jobs goes on to say that Flash was designed for PCs and mice. So are the majority of programs out there. Quite frankly, if an application is written in HTML5, it has no better course that it can take over Flash for using a touch surface. You can't use an example and say something that was written in Flash that you try to use touch on is fair game. I would say, hey, if the developer goes in, uses Adobe's Flash tools to make something touch aware, i.e. probably bigger hotspot areas and so on and so forth, there is really no claim over any other coding language that would be used to try to have a touch experience. Thus, Jobs actually answered his own question that he posed, that Flash sites need to be rewritten. And so does any other HTML website that is not touch aware, whether it's an HTML4 or HTML5. Everything would have to be rewritten to go from expecting a mouse to a finger. So Jobs in itself answered his own question there and makes that point moot. Then Jobs finally goes into what he considers one of the most important points, in that having a layer in between the programmer and the actual end platform. There is no rule that states a native application will run better than a cross-compiled application. I know both very crappy applications that are written in native languages to any platform, and the same goes for cross-compiling. And I also know very good applications that are both native and cross-compiled. Completely a moot point. Apple itself cross-compiles to make its software for Windows. It is a real-world application that is never going to go away. The cost of developers learning so many tools and that is heavily unlikely, and it's why it's really not happened. Developers can either be a universal developer in programming for many platforms using one tool, or they could be one-sided in that they only do stuff for Microsoft or for Linux or for Apple. But many, from a programmer's point of view, would like to have the largest consumer base possible and spend the least amount of resources to do so. Apple, in its own interests, being a business decision, does the same. Is it going to write iTunes? Is Apple going to write iTunes in C# and other parts of Apple software that run on Windows? What about all the other games that were bragged about being in the App Store that come from being cross-compiled? So they're all subpar. It's a contradiction to say, well, cross-compiling from Unity 3D and MonoTouch and all this other stuff are subpar applications, and then iTunes for Windows, and yet still want to make the claim to say just use native. Then Jobs goes on to say that Adobe would love developers to go to its platform to make games universally for most of the platforms out there. Who doesn't? Developers are the key. Applications are the end result that all users seek to do. We don't buy computers just to have the operating system. We need to have the operating system provide a service in delivering applications to us. So everybody has interest. It's the whole point of the policy that Apple, in trying to drive more developers for Xcode, and I applaud that movement, because the more that do go to Xcode gives and lends more to the OS X model and platform, whether it be mobile or desktop, in delivering more apps. That's something I actually advocated in my series in setting OS X free. Then Jobs goes on that cross-compiling doesn't always utilize the best feature sets that are available. Where is the rule that says that actually native apps will get to experience those feature sets? Normally, a developer writes the application, then the platform on the next go-round adds new features, and they're more powerful features. There's nothing that says a developer goes back to the application and enhances their application. It can happen, and usually they'll do a charge for that, but it still requires a rewrite, which then also, if it's cross-compiled, equates to the cross-compiler getting a rewrite to have to those features. In either case, code needs to be rewritten. Unless, of course, a business decision is made to not necessarily support a certain avenue, i.e. Carbon 64. When clearly Apple announced at WWDC 2006 that 64-bit would be driven all the way up to the UI for Carbon Support 64. It was a business decision to eventually back out of it. And I understand, Leopard was delayed, other things have priority, but nonetheless, that's within a business decision realm, and it's within Apple's rights to do so. But it is not a technical issue. At the same time that it was a business decision to back off of Carbon 64-bit, let's talk about features, even within OS X. Grand Central Dispatch. How many native Apple applications are using Grand Central Dispatch to give the user a better experience? Or for that matter, OpenCL. And how many applications have been rewritten to even take advantage of the 64-bit now available libraries within OS X? The point being that development does take time. And when feature sets come up, whether it's native or cross-compiled, there is no guarantee or better guarantee on either side stating the application will get to use those feature sets. Then Jobs goes in to say Adobe's been painfully slow to accept enhancements. So have you, Jobs. It took you forever to get QuickTime over. Final Cut Studio is still not Cocoa. iTunes is not Cocoa, and that's one of your biggest marketplaces. And again, how many of Apple's own native applications are written 64 are using Grand Central Dispatch or OpenCL? Don't know. But it's not correct to say, especially when Apple themselves in 2006 gives a roadmap to go 64-bit in Carbon, provide libraries in developer seeds, but then want to make a claim that Adobe was painfully slow. So to conclude my point, all of which is very much a business decision, contrary to your thesis of saying we're not driven primarily by business decisions but technical issues. I still have yet to see the technical issue. And this brings me to the point. Adobe is releasing, finally, granted, its mobile version of Flash. By your own words, implying that we've moved on to more advanced things, being HTML5, although I would disagree with that. There are very many things that need to come to light to actually purport HTML5 as the end-all be-all. Granted, a lot of this hinges on just videos, which is a whole lot more than just video out there to discuss, especially when you're talking about rich media. It encompasses far more. But let's say Adobe produces a damn good Flash version to run on mobile devices. The impression I get from the letter is that you still wouldn't be interested, even if it were a good version from Adobe. The other side of that coin is, even in the response, it's very fair to say, look, Adobe, you've dragged your feet on providing a mobile solution. We're moving on. Completely understandable. Because that in itself lends to say, hey, when you finally do get your act together, we'll have a look at it. We'll have a look at your mobile version of Flash. And I don't see that anywhere within this letter. So let me ask you, Steve Jobs, if Adobe does produce a darn good mobile version of Flash, would you embrace it? I think the answer would still be no, which would then really make the whole point, beyond what I've stated here, of technical issues moot, in that it really is a business decision. But that's my point, is that it's okay to be a business decision. Everybody makes business decisions, which really goes back to the point of I'm shocked that you were compelled to write such a letter. Who is a letter really for? Thanks for watching.